All right, good morning, everyone. God is in the dance, God is in the poetry, God is in the music, God is in the silence. And we're going to pray for a big God because we need God to be in the history lecture too. You see before you on the slide the title of my lecture, The Matthew 25 Church That Never Was, the Matthew 25 Church That Is Here Today. Next slide, please. In addition to teaching history at a seminary, I am a parent of 2 teenage kids. It is truly wonderful to witness their growth from infanthood to the young people they are today, a high school sophomore and a middle school 7th grader. When one of them was younger, in that tween phase of life, I remember a time when he shouted from the bathroom, "I think there is a problem." I answered, "What's going on?" He said, "The toilet is broken. I've tried everything, but it will not flush." I replied from a distance, "What did you try?" He said, "I pushed down on the handle. And then I did it again, and then I did it again, and then I did it again. I tried everything, but the toilet is broken." Next slide, please. So I found the nearby plunger, and fortunately, I was able to fix the toilet. And as modern parenting goes, my kid and I spent the next 35 minutes staring at my phone down a YouTube rabbit hole, explaining the science behind how a plunger fixes a toilet. Next slide. I ordinarily, as a seminary professor, deal with eschatology and not scatology, but I share this story because it reminds me sometimes of what happens in our congregations. Next slide, please. Churches, like toilets, get stuck. There are seasons of decline, confusion, infighting, and apathy. And like my kid, we think we've tried everything to revitalize our congregations, but in some cases, we have actually tried only the same thing or familiar things over and over and over again. Such as, we are singing new hymns from the Glory to God hymnal. We started a contemporary worship service. We added vegan and gluten-free snacks in addition to the donuts and bagels for fellowship time. Our new associate pastor is a millennial who has a tattoo. Next slide, please. What I appreciate about the Matthew 25 movement is how it both encourages and challenges us to pray, think, worship, and act in fresh and innovative ways about Christian ministry today. It is not a call to repeatedly try the same thing, but rather it is an invitation to behold new possibilities and opportunities. My aim is to take us on a journey into our American past to demonstrate why the Matthew 25 church is simultaneously the church that never was and the church that is here today. Next slide, please. In The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story, legal scholar and law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Kermit Roosevelt III, affirms the emergence of a more honest pursuit of U.S. history today. Roosevelt commends how a growing number of Americans want more than, in his words, the standard story, which told us reassuring things about ourselves, that we were good, that we always succeeded, that our history was a steady progress toward the realization of deep and noble founding ideals, end quote. But it is also hard for many to let go of this story. For some, the story is ingrained and it provides ongoing nourishment and meaning. To revise the story is to uproot foundational understandings of oneself and one's community, as well as perhaps national service in the U.S. Armed Forces, Peace Corps, and other similar endeavors. Yet, the story needs to change simply because it is not true. The United States was not founded as a multiracial democracy. Roosevelt observes that the Declaration of Independence expresses the ideal of equal rights, but the legal scholar summons a closer look at the document's origins and maintains that it was composed at a specific moment and for a specific purpose, quoting his words, to announce that the American colonists were throwing off allegiance to the British crown and to justify that act, end quote. The inclusion of indigenous nations and black persons in the document are strictly in reference to complaints against British imperialism. The one reference to indigenous nations identifies them as, quote, merciless Indian savages, end quote, who the British seek to marshal as military allies. The passing allusion to black people is found in a solitary line about the, quote, domestic insurrections among us, end quote, which is a grievance against the Virginia governor, Lord Dunmore, for his promise of freedom to enslaved persons who enlisted in his army against the rebelling patriots. Indigenous and black soldiers fought for both sides in the American Revolutionary War. Veterans of color, such as the black abolitionist and Philadelphia sailmaker James Forten, battled alongside white patriots for American independence. But the victory they helped to achieve only resulted in a democratic nation for white people. The origins of the United States lie within English colonization, which was undergirded by the systems of settler colonialism and slavery. And these racial oppressions persisted and in some cases intensified as they and expanded in. Next slide, please. William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist for over 30 years when he published a tract on the infidelity of abolitionism in 18. And 2 years later, he helped to establish Slavery Society, the most significant abolitionist organization in the United States. The drive for black liberation was met by an equally fierce opposition. Next slide. Hence, in 1860, Garrison responded to the long-standing accusation that abolitionism was atheistic and anti-Christian. White Christians misused the Bible in appealing for abolition. Garrison explained that his most ardent detractors were white Christians. The infidelity, in quotes, of the abolition movement was also the infidelity of the women's rights movement. It was also the rights movement. It was also the infidelity of the right for justice for our LGBTQ plus siblings. And it is also, if we are honest today, the accusation of the infidelity of the Matthew 25 movement. This is our history and this is our present. Every nation had distinct societal injustices that were difficult to reform, precisely because, in Garrison's understanding, they had grown so large as to become. Garrison observed of his nation, quote, the one great, distinctive, all-conquering sin in America is its system of chattel slavery, end quote. One demonstration of slavery's force was its reach in white Christian America, in which, again, I'll quote from Garrison, the spirit of slavery was omnipresent, invading every sanctuary, infecting every pulpit, controlling every press, corrupting every household, and blinding every vision, end quote. Garrison was an avowed pacifist who promoted nonviolent resistance, but he also recognized that his righteous cause was at odds with powerful forces. He did not hesitate to declare that he and his abolitionist colleagues were engaged in a moral and religious. To Presbyterians and other Reformed folks, that his tactics were the same as the early modern Protestant reformers, such as Martin Luther and John Calvin. He noted, you're accusing me of infidelity? I'm just doing what they were doing. Because every great reform movement, again in Garrison's words, must display antagonism to public quietude and good order, and make the whole social, political, and religious structure tremble to its foundations. Garrison understood slavery's evils. He understood this foundational evil that was engrafted in American life and in the American church. How are we going to fix it? The only way is to get to the foundation itself and level it and change it and confront it. He found inspiration from Matthew 25, and he believed that the true message of the gospel was revealed in Christ's identification. Oppressed. He said literally, Christ identifies with those who are downtrodden and oppressed. You might be able to see there on that page 10 of his text, there's a little footnote, and it says on the bottom, see Matthew 25. Around the same time, next slide please, that Garrison launched his abolitionist newspaper, William Appice published his autobiography, rural Massachusetts town of Coleraine in 1798, who endured a difficult childhood in Connecticut. He grew up in abject poverty within an indigenous community that had withstood nearly 2 centuries of colonial aggression and white intrusion. After English combatants defeated the Pequots in a brutal war, the Treaty of Hartford in 1638 stipulated that the surviving Pequots, primarily women and children, must live among the Mohegans or the Narragansetts. Before the treaty, some Pequot prisoners of war had been sold to slave traders who engaged in human trafficking throughout the Caribbean. The precise destinations of these enslaved Pequots are unknown, but we know from one account of colonial Massachusetts that at least 80 were, quote, sent to Bermuda and sold into slavery, end quote. The victorious English colonists declared that the Pequots would, quote, never again inhabit their native country, nor should any of them be called Pequots anymore, end quote. But the Pequots in New England reconstituted, and they maintained 2 tracts of land in southeastern Connecticut at the time of Appice's birth. And when Appice published his autobiography, A Son of the Forest, he clearly in the subtitle and on the very first page that he was a Pequot. Appice has spent the previous 4 years as a Methodist preacher assigned a circuit across Long Island, the Hudson River Valley, New Bedford, Providence, and Boston, ministering primarily among indigenous, Black, and multiracial congregations of color. He had received discriminatory treatment from some white Methodists, encountered racial oppression at every turn of his life, and he carried in his body the traumatic history of genocidal violence against his people. Appice therefore wanted the world to know that he was a Christian, that he was a Pequot, and that his people had not been blotted out from their ancestral homeland. Next slide. In 1830, Appice wrote, quote, I've been asked time and time again whether I did not sincerely believe that God had more respect to the white man than to the untutored son of the forest. I answer, and always answer such in the language of Scripture, no, God is no respecter of persons, end quote. Appice rebuked white Christians for misconstruing the gospel with their racism, and he found it appalling that too many acted as though God created the white race as superior to indigenous and Black races. The principles of Christian discipleship were evident to Appice and encapsulated in Matthew 22, verses 37 to 40, a scriptural passage that recounts Jesus' answer that love for God and love for neighbor are the 2 greatest commandments. But Appice was troubled because white Christians did little to protest and less to change racially discriminatory laws and practices. White Christians lived in Appice's understanding as though they were the only beloved images of God, and therefore would not be held accountable for stealing indigenous lands, enslaving Africans and indigenous peoples, and depriving people of color of their civil rights. Appice demanded a reformation within white Christianity in which, quote, noble-hearted Christians, stop not till this tree of distinction shall be leveled to the earth, and the mantle of prejudice torn from every American heart, end quote. And the mantle of prejudice be torn from every American heart. Appice connected the ministry of changing individual hearts, this mantle, with the racial distinctions that needed to be leveled, such that changing individual Christian hearts would directly lead to the work of changing racially unjust laws, racially unjust policies, and racially unjust structures. What we do in here has to matter and change the world out there. This is something that Appice understood, and this is something that he wondered and he wandered and he prayed and he wrestled with. What do all those white Christians do in their churches in Massachusetts? Next slide, please. Christianity has always been practiced by humans in specific contexts. American Christianity was forged in the context of a nation rife with democratic fervor, economic ingenuity, moral compromise, and racial oppression. The American idea that citizens could form their own government and elect their own leaders was a radical departure from England and truly a bold political experiment in the late 18th century. Similarly, the notion of a voluntary church comprised a new approach to Christianity. Many European observers marveled at the growth and strength of church life in the United States. Their churches at home relied upon direct financial support from the government. But American churches exercised an incarnational creativity as they fashioned themselves into institutional forms that resonated with the people living among them. They were just amazed. That was another bold experiment. The idea that churches could not only survive and thrive without government support, without direct taxpayer money. This was just not what happened in England and much of Western Europe. And so they thought, how are churches ever going to provide enough compensation, not only to keep their building maintenance, but actually attract the best and brightest clergy? And then, sadly, it was mostly men, when they could have other jobs and other occupations, such as the law, that might pay more. But somehow they're amazed. These churches, the people they come, the people tithes and offerings they give, and some of the clergy in the United States are among the best and the brightest. The outdoor camp meeting in a rural community and the formal worship service in an urban church building differed greatly from one another. But the gathering shared a common purpose. Preachers and worship leaders conveyed spiritual teachings in effective ways to help people know, feel, and commune with God in modes that were most familiar and intelligible to them. Yet, one severe limitation in the making of American Christianity is found in the failure of white churches on racial justice. Next slide, please. The church has never been, so I've got a few points here, maybe 5. The first here is, the church has never been a strictly spiritual institution. Christians assemble in churches for many reasons. Certainly, 2 of the primary reasons are communal worship and religious education. But churches are also social organizations that have adhered to larger social customs and hierarchies. In colonial New England, persons of higher social rank were given priority during communion and received the elements first. On some occasions, ministers and lay leaders who were responsible for distributing the elements struggled to discern as they looked out into the congregation where to go with the bread and the cup that represented the body and blood of Jesus Christ. In one colonial Massachusetts church, a deacon deeply offended Samuel Sewall, a prominent and wealthy worshiper, when he offered the cup to a nearby worshiper before him. Next slide, please. Churches in the North American colonies and the United States also practiced racial segregation in their sanctuaries. Worshippers of color sat in a designated section apart from white worshipers, and they also received the communion elements after white worshipers. Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and several other black worshipers angrily left a Methodist church in Philadelphia, I believe it was in 1787, due to its enforcement of racial segregation. A few white worshipers also protested the racism within their churches, but many more accepted the discriminatory practices because it resembled their white dominant societies. In one Presbyterian church in New York City, a group of white worshipers in 1834 irately opposed the action of one of its members, the white abolitionist Arthur Tappan, when he invited Samuel Eli Cornish, his black friend, pastor and colleague in the American Anti-Slavery Society, to sit next to him during worship. Then members by noting that Jesus was a man of color. Samuel Cox was the pastor's name, and he asked, where would Jesus sit in our congregation? To persuade them to choose spiritual principles over social norms. Next slide. The social aspects of church life are inescapable, and some components bear their own complexities. The tradition of adorning fancy apparel to worship, to look one's Sunday best, has religious and social motivations. A worshiper wants to dress finely to honor God, but also to impress fellow worshipers. For worshipers in the middling classes, Sunday worship provided the only time of the week in which one could wear their finest clothes, and the act of dressing up for church attendance was a means to restore dignity and celebrate self-worth. One pitfall for American churches is found in the overt and subtle ways that unjust social norms, such as racial prejudice, permeate the ministry and worship of a congregation. At one level, churches must resemble the specific cultural context they inhabit. It has to resonate, it has to be intelligible. But social patterns alone should not determine the direction of one's ministry. Some church members may resist the necessary imposition of the gospel, but there is no change without confrontation. There is no progress without protest, and there is no discipleship without dissent. There is simply no other way. And this is what William Lloyd Garrison understood. You accuse me of breaking up your unity. You accuse me of breaking up your fellowship. You accuse me of trying to root out foundational society in our lives. That is exactly what I'm doing, because this is what a protest movement looks like. In many ways, he continued to appeal to Luther. He appealed to John Knox too, and to Calvin, because he understood that the Protestant movement was a protesting movement. And he wanted that to happen in his country, and he wanted it to happen to end slavery and anti-black racism. Next slide. So if my first point is, we need to be honest and recognize that the church has never been, is not today, and never will be a strictly spiritual institution. Does not mean that it is not at all not a spiritual institution, but it is a lot of things. The second point I'd like to make is that we as the church must equip people of faith for civic participation. We must equip people of faith for civic participation. Many American Christians then and now have struggled to discern how to negotiate the relationship between religion and politics. One reason why is because of the centrality of politics in the United States. Political elections, especially presidential ones, dominate public discourse in this country, in part because it was founded as a democracy. It is not surprising that Americans care deeply about who they vote for, since what first set the U.S. apart was the radical idea that a nation works best when its citizens elect their own leaders. Many European observers highlighted the passion, the fury, and the divisiveness of American politics in the antebellum era. They expressed astonishment at how Americans viewed the politicians vying for their votes. Candidates were spoken of in either reverential or caustic tones, depending on who one supported. And voters transformed the candidates into projections of their own morality and intelligence. The English traveler and author Francis Trollope was bewildered by how some Americans identified themselves by the presidential candidate they preferred. One person exclaimed, "Jackson forever," and another shouted, "Clay forever," as both distinguished themselves by their political support for Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, respectively. Politics have always mattered a great deal to Americans because voting is a crucial component to civic participation. But American churches find themselves on a tightrope in seeking to fulfill their spiritual mission within this political context. Churches err when they elevate presidential politics to the highest priority of their ministry. But churches also stumble when they forego the imperative to reform societal injustices simply because they want to escape the intensity and rancor of presidential politics. It's a tightrope. You can fall one way and you can fall the other. Don't want to make presidential politics everything, but you don't want to escape the world, the nation, and the society because of the rancor of presidential politics. That rancor, that intensity, that is not new. And so now we have to figure out as a church how we're going to grapple with it, how we're going to wrestle with it, how we're going to discern, how we're going to do the hard thing. Next slide. The extent to which the contentious political debate over slavery shaped American churches is evident in the ecclesiology of James Henry Thornwell. In 1851, the white South Carolinian pro-slavery theologian joined other Christian thinkers in several denominations in his advocacy of the position that churches should refrain from participating in the abolition movement because slavery was a political matter outside the spiritual jurisdiction of church governance. But Thornwell stretched the notion of an apolitical ecclesiology to an extreme measure and insisted that the church was, quote, not a moral institute of universal good. The church is not a moral institute of universal good, whose business it is to wage war upon every form of human ill, whether social. That's not what the church is. It's not supposed to make the world a better place. He further argued that the Bible did not explicitly instruct churches to, quote, construct society afresh or adjust its elements in different proportions. The church, that I can't find it in the Bible, is not called, commissioned to construct society afresh or adjust its elements in different proportions. In order to uphold the evil system of slavery, Thornwell stripped the American church bare and remade it into little more than a self-interested religious social club. But pro-slavery Christians, such as James Henry Thornwell, actually never retreated from civic participation. They fervently defended slavery and actively opposed abolitionism. Churches applied this doctrine of the spirituality of the church selectively. It became a convenient tool to maintain a comfortable and easy approach to civic participation. We can be against alcoholism and for prohibition from the pulpit because that is a human rights issue. That is something that every Christian should care about in that understanding. But we are not for the women's rights movement because that is a political issue. We are not for slavery because that is a political issue. It is the selective kind of methodology around it. Churches chose then, and I think even today, what social issues to engage in accordance with the interests of their congregants. After the Civil War, so again, some congregants have firm convictions about separation of religion and politics, such that even the politics that they support and like, they say, nope, that doesn't belong in the church. But I believe many more actually are not against political activity, civic participation, but they're against political activity that is against them in the church. Churches are not against political preaching, whatever have you, but churches are against political preaching that is not the politics that they support and agree with. Not in all cases. Again, after the Civil War, here's an example. Many white churches deemed racial justice and poverty as political matters beyond the scope of their spiritual ministries. But the same churches interpreted their mobilizing efforts to maintain segregationist laws and establish their own private schools after integration as within the bounds of appropriate and faithful civic participation. Very few churches that purely apply this doctrine. And one reason why is because the United States was founded as a political democracy. American churches must acknowledge that the roots of our contemporary struggle to balance evangelism, worship, and social justice lie in pro-slavery Christianity. So we can argue and we can say that there are some dangers about being too civically involved, too politically involved, too partisan and the like. And we can say that there are perhaps some healthy approaches to maintaining this doctrine that emerged in pro-slavery Christianity. And I'm glad for us to have that discussion, and I'm glad for us to dialogue together. But what I would like us to do in this dialogue is to altogether acknowledge that the foundation of that doctrine lies in defending slavery and oppressing black people. That's where it came from. We can talk about how it's evolved and where it is today, but I would like us to spend a few moments to say that's where it came from. Becoming a Matthew 25 church, next slide please, is a long, hard, but worthy endeavor. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, challenged American churches in 1973 to incorporate civic participation within its spiritual mission. Quote, "Quite often the church gives the distinct impression that it is concerned exclusively with its own self-preservation, but the clergy must assume a strong role in preparing young men and women to function meaningfully as religiously engaged citizens who are able to cope with the economic, social, religious, and political problems of the day. Clergy must assume a strong role in preparing young men and women to function meaningfully as religiously engaged citizens. I am a seminary professor, and some of my students come from ecclesial traditions that emphasize the doctrine of the spirituality of the church. Our conversations, therefore, engaged a strong feeling of suspicion or even outright antipathy toward religiously engaged citizenship. So I share my own parable. One day, a pastor purchases a loaf of bread from a local bakery. Then on the way home, the pastor encounters a person who is impoverished and hungry. The pastor prays, "God, what are you calling me to do?" and decides to offer the loaf of bread to this person. But in addition to this act of charity, the gospel inspires the pastor to ask a second question. Why doesn't this person have bread in the first place? Christian ministry must be simultaneously devoted to pursuing worship that honors God and the church and seeking liberation for persons facing oppression in the world. Since every person is a beloved child of God, created in God's image, Christians must work toward constructing a society in which every person has dignity, freedom, and fair structural access to education, employment, food, clean water, worship, and other necessities of life. Next slide. In 1843, John Jay II, a lawyer and active member of the Episcopal Church, whose granddaddy William Jay, was the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He implored white Christians in a pamphlet to confront caste and slavery in the American church. Jay marked the complicity among white Christians toward racial oppression as a betrayal of scriptural teachings. He was also dismayed at how these Christians expended all of their energy and piety to build magnificent sanctuaries and prove the religious superiority of their distinctive doctrines. Jay surmised, quote, "Are we to give arbitrary bodies for ourselves, parties, little sects, selfish distinctions, churches within the church? Our hearts, then, are not large enough," end quote. The Matthew 25 movement is ultimately a test of the heart. I am not criticizing churches for caring about their worship spaces and doctrinal distinctives, because I agree that these are important components of our Christian ministry. But I want to amplify John Jay II's insight and ask whether our hearts are large enough to enact God's love, to enact God's justice, to enact God's mercy, and to enact God's righteousness in the common world that we inhabit. The Matthew 25 movement ultimately is a test of the heart. Are our hearts large enough? My third point, next slide, in addition to civic participation, the church, sometimes we mistake congregational activity for civic action. Churches can and should be busy places. Christians frequently point to the number of congregational activities as an indicator of ministry success. At one level, the presence of an array of worship services, youth group outings, Bible study meetings, short-term mission trips, reading groups, and committees is certainly a sign of a vibrant congregation. But at another level, churches working toward racial justice fall short when they equate their congregational activities with concrete civic action. The racial justice ministries of some churches focus on the following two activities: reading groups and multicultural worship services. Reading groups select several books ranging from fiction novels by authors of color to history and theology books about racism and discuss them together. Committees plan occasional multicultural worship services that integrate liturgies, prayers, and songs from diverse ethnic and racial sources, and sometimes invite special choirs and preachers representing various communities of color. Both endeavors often invigorate a congregation, but these two activities alone do not amount to effective action if the goal is to participate in constructing a more racially just society. One way that churches can assess their ministries for racial justice is to examine how their congregational activities resulted in civic actions. For example, how did our reading groups, how did our multicultural worship services transform the lives and actions of individual church members? And how is our church working to advance the common good in our local community? How did that reading group help us to advance the common good? How did that multicultural worship service help us to advance the common good? So I am not here to dismantle reading groups. I am not here to eradicate multicultural worship services. These are good endeavors that help people of faith understand the bigness of who God is and the urgency of defeating racial and economic oppression. But sometimes the connection does not happen. Sometimes it is this, and what I shared yesterday in my workshop, one challenge is there is the 80-20 problem in churches. 20% of the folks are doing 80% of the work. In racial and economic justice work, another 80-20 problem is that congregations spend 80% of their time doing 20% of the work, so that there is not enough energy left to do the real hard work. We have spent 80% of our time planning these reading groups. We have spent 80% of our time planning and executing this multicultural worship service. And then there is no time to do, no energy to do the other work. Or we spend 80% of our time fighting about a statement, a banner, something in our bulletin and program that is against something and that thing, such that there is no energy to actually, once that statement is there, once that banner is there, to do the work. So I'm not against the banner. I'm not against the reading group, and I'm not against the multicultural worship service. But I do want us to also honestly and hopefully and joyfully reflect that is that 80% of the work or is that 20% of the work? And if that's 20% of the work, let's get to work at the other 80%. Next slide, please. My fourth point. The church, I believe, we should prioritize responsibility and repair over guilt and privilege. We should prioritize responsibility and repair over guilt and privilege. Pequot pastor William Appice delivered a lecture before white audiences in New England in 1835 and 1836 that differentiated between responsibility and guilt. He specifically stated toward the end of his lecture that indigenous peoples and white Americans were not guilty of their ancestors' crimes. He did say, I thank God, and I'm going to use gender exclusive language for a second, that you and I are not guilty of our father's crimes. But Appice also believed that past mistakes shaped present injustices in the common world that everyone living in the 1830s inhabited. White American Christians therefore had a responsibility to repair the nation and to repair the church that they had inherited. It is a crucial step toward accepting responsibility and enacting repair. Because we need to precisely comprehend the consequences of settler colonialism and slavery in our neighborhoods, communities, churches, and nation. One challenge that has emerged in recent years as we strive toward racial justice is the confusion between responsibility and guilt. I have participated in diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops that have intentionally and unintentionally accentuated guilt and privilege over responsibility and repair. The historical facts presented were accurate and therefore revealed an ugly, horrible, racist, and brutal past. But the objective in some cases was to induce guilt and shame from participants who were white or non-Indigenous and non-Black people of color. In other instances, facilitators moved the group from charting a timeline of past sins to ranking hierarchies of privilege in the present. Inherent and unearned privilege across race, gender, class, and ability, and other components certainly exists in American society today. And privilege itself is a historically constructed phenomenon. But I find that sometimes racial privilege is overemphasized and oversimplified. The task of understanding racial privilege is helpful when it is directed toward responsibility and repair. It is important to recognize that some people, simply on the basis of skin color, have more access to flourishing than other people, and that people of color endure the harsh pains of racism in the arenas of education and employment, as well as in the quotidian, everyday rhythms of life. But I find that discussions of racial privilege quickly devolve into heated debates about how to incorporate gender, class, and other considerations. I appreciate the attention to intersectionality, but I am discouraged when dialogues about privilege focus less on building diverse coalitions and more on determining who embodies the least privilege and who bears the most guilt. I find that discussions of racial privilege also frequently conflate the histories of settler colonialism, slavery, and other racial oppressions in ways that obscure the unique histories of different communities of color. The descendants of indigenous nations and the descendants of Black enslavement share a common history, but each community also has their own distinctive stories of courage, tragedy, joy, and subjugation. Other communities of color, such as Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Latino Americans, also retain and share their own particular stories of hope, travail, resilience, and oppression. We must also remember the witness of white indigenous rights activists, abolitionists, and other allies for racial justice, such as the great William Lloyd Garrison. Because Garrison does not represent how most white Christians lived in his day, it would be wrong to present him as a counterpoint that disproves the failures of white Christianity. It is the kind of whataboutism when we get into this history, but what about? What about this abolitionist? What about this activist? What about that ally? Certainly, we want to remember them. And in fact, we want to highlight them so that we can learn from their courage, we can learn from their struggle, we can learn from their conviction. So, Garrison's story and other similar stories do provide us blueprints to learn from today. But the lesson isn't the whataboutism to try to balance the scale. Rather, it is one lesson, not the only, but one lesson is the necessity for white Christians within their own churches and denominations to confront and rebuke the racist attitudes and actions of other white Christians in their midst. Church unity is one goal of Christian ministry, but we fall into grave sin and idolatry when we make church unity the goal of Christian ministry. It is a goal, it is not the goal. The goal remains the gospel. The goal remains, in this context, the Matthew 25 movement. We want to learn one another's stories, to honor one another, and more effectively work together towards substantive repair that simultaneously addresses the consequences of specific historic sins and constructs a more just and inclusive society for people of all ethnicities, all races, all genders, all classes, and all abilities. We have to do both, and we cannot pit one against the other. We want a just and inclusive society, but we do not want to ignore specific historic sins that Indigenous and Black people have endured and have risen above and continue to try to rise above in this country. We have to do both. When we talk about justice for Indigenous people, we can't say, but what about climate change right away? We need to stop for a second and listen and learn. What is this specific sin? What about repair for the descendants of enslaved Black people? But what also about the classism? What also about this? Yes, but in this moment, we need to address this specific sin. And if we are in a church, we are in a church-related institution that has direct connection to those historic sins of land theft and of chattel slavery. We need to address that. We need to make that wrong right. Yes, it's been over 200, 300, 400 years, and it gets harder and harder over time. But the accountability remains. Black theologian, next slide, and ethicist who teaches at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, Scott Williamson. I find that he offers two insights that aid us in our journey of responsibility and repair. His first insight is that, quote, character and circumstance render each other. And he explains a little later. What this means is that our lives are shaped by moral systems and immoral systems, even as we lend shape to them. Character and circumstance render each other. We are not defined only by our circumstance. We are not defined only by our character, but it's those two together. And he has a second beautiful, powerful insight, that we inherit and edit a moral world. Put in another way, we edit what we inherit. We rejoice in the reforms that have transpired and the progress that has been made, but we must continue to repair the social injustices in our world today. We do not need American churches. We do not need Matthew 25 churches to be exceptional, just faithful. The circumstances of voluntarism have shaped the character of American churches. As voluntary organizations, churches in this country have always exercised authenticity and imagination to meet the needs and wants of Christians across diverse social contexts. At their best, churches constantly integrate the pastoral and prophetic components of ministry, such that their ministries provide comfort for the afflicted, meaningful opportunities for worship and fellowship, and spiritual instruction that leads to individual growth and neighborhood and societal transformation. But at their worst, churches succumb to larger cultural, economic, social, and racially unjust forces and promote a false gospel of self-interest and self-delusion and self-preservation with biblical interpretations that justify the perpetuation of horrible sins. This is the challenge before us. In the time of slavery, for example, one option for Christians, it is wrong, so I'm going to do something about it. Another option for Christians, it is wrong, but I don't want to do anything about it. But that's a hard option for Christians to do. So then this third option appears. It's not wrong, it's right. So I don't have to do anything about it. And it is sad and it is hard because that is an attractive option for Christians who want to maintain the status quo. Not that it's wrong, but rather this wrong is actually right. This is a hard but necessary truth that you and I, that we must acknowledge as editors of our moral world. And finally, my last point is that we, the church, must be deeply hopeful and deeply honest about our past, present, and future. Just as the fullness of history inspires and infuriates us, so too does the complexity of our world today. There exists beauty and brokenness, as well as abundance and scarcity all around us. Many Christians survey the ongoing contradictions and compromises within American Christianity. And we want to overturn desecrated tables, just like Jesus did. Yet these same Christians are also thankful for the churches that have nurtured and shaped them. And they affirm the churches today that are enacting justice and love in their communities. John Leith, the white Reformed theologian, taught for many years at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Virginia. He observes, quote, "The church has never found it easy to to balance gratitude with critical judgment." End quote. The easier pathway is to set gratitude and critical judgment against one another in a winner-takes-all context. And the church's struggle is also our nation's. As Americans, we grapple with practicing a patriotism that holds the successes, failures, ideals, and injustices of the United States in productive tension. Next slide. One irony is that churches have the resources to foster healthy and productive dialogues among persons with diverse cultural and political perspectives that enable mutual understanding and growth in balancing gratitude with critical judgment. Churches, and especially Presbyterian churches, in a polity that does not have bishops appointing ministers, we are voluntary organizations that can only survive and thrive with foundational bonds of relational trust. Church members do not always agree on every issue, but over time they learn to trust one another. Good pastors develop strong relationships with church members over time and through accompaniment in hardship. But too many churches refrain from hosting difficult, urgent, and ultimately clarifying and edifying conversations that will lead to civic action. And this is something that I mourn and that I grieve and that frustrates me to no end. So I'm going to end here in a minute, but I will say one thing in Matthew 25 churches. If you're a Matthew 25 church here or on the live stream, and if you've got a good pastor who's been with you for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 12 years, 15 years, who's been with you in the hospital, who's been with you at the funeral, who's been with you at the wedding, who moderates your session, and who is with you and working with you, not perfect, but working with you, spending their 525,600 minutes with you. Do not get angry when they preach for 3 minutes in a sermon a political position that you disagree with. Do not throw away the 525,600 minutes for those 3 minutes. Do you trust? Here's what happens. Don't change it. My pastor officiated my kid's wedding. My pastor did a beautiful job at this funeral. But that pastor, same person, preached about that on Sunday. Can you believe it? Don't change the my pastor into that pastor. There's a foundational trust that has been built. So even if you disagree with that position, and I grant that, there's complex, and I grant that your pastor, smart, sharp, but refining and working through their own positions on how to elucidate Christian discipleship amid political polarization. They're figuring it out too, and they're journeying with you. So we've got to let our pastors preach. So one criticism of the Reformed tradition is that we've cared too much about words and too little about actions. I certainly agree and want to reform and change that. But at another level, I'm like, but we've gotten pretty good with words. And so for these Matthew 25 churches, let your pastor say the hard words. Let your pastor say the good words. Let your pastor say the challenging words so that ultimately there can be growth. Again, there is no change without confrontation. There is no progress without protest. There is no discipleship without dissent. So we've got to figure out a way. People are asking me all the time, how are you teaching pastors to preach and lead in purple churches, politically divisive churches, even some Matthew 25 churches? You all at the seminary need to do a better job teaching your your seminary students. And at one level I agree, and we're working with that. We are saying, it's got to be incremental. You can't go in on the first Sunday and say this, that thing is wrong. All of that. But at another level, pastors need to grow. Professors need to grow. Here's the thing though, churches need to grow too. And our congregations have got to figure out a way. If you're a lay leader in a congregation, we've got to figure out ways to empower our clergy. We've got to figure out ways to support our clergy. In some communities that we exist in, we inhabit, that we live in, for some of us, the only woman who wears a collar. Your pastor might be the only woman of color in your town. Your pastor might be the only queer or trans person in your town. Your pastor might be the only white man pastor who is grappling with economic and racial injustice in your town. So again, I'm not saying pastors are perfect. We certainly are not. But please let us preach. Please let us challenge. Let us provoke. Let us grow together with you. So here's the thing. So because conflict and departure have always been part of what it is in the American church, it does temper the potential for deep and sustained engagement about our most pressing matters, such as, where else but the church can we really discern and figure out how do we honor military veterans and police officers while also decrying and seeking to reform the excesses of militarism and police brutality? Hey, I'm going to be honest, we haven't figured it out yet. That is really hard work. So where else but the church can we do that work? How are we going to figure out how to secure our nation's borders without demeaning refugees and vilifying immigrants? That's also really hard. And so we've got to figure that out. Churches have got to be the place where rather than fearing conflict, rather than fearing departure, we've got to figure out here, we're going to do this together. And we're going to figure this out. We're going to let the pastor preach. We're going to learn and we're going to grow together. So in closing, I will say the Matthew 25 church journey, in my estimation, it will require both patience and persistence because it is filled with joyful engagement and painful disappointment. Exactly 1 century after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, a young black Baptist minister was imprisoned in Birmingham, Alabama, for helping to organize a nonviolent demonstration against racial segregation. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sat in his prison cell in 1963, he composed a letter reflecting on the resistance to racial justice that abounded in many white churches. King saw majestic buildings filled with busy worshipers, participating in a plethora of congregational activities, and he wondered, quote, what kind of people worship here? What kind of people worship here? Who is their God? A little later in his letter, he divulged that these questions swirled in his mind, and it caused him to weep. But Dr. King wrote that his tears were tears of love, because, quote, there can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love, end quote. There is no one kind of Matthew 25 church, and therefore each of us are on our own distinctive journeys, but we share a common hope and a common heartbreak. We are angry and lament the Matthew 25 church that never was, but we rejoice and be glad, and we edit what we inherit, the Matthew 25 church that is here today. Amen.